The idea of getting in or roping in parties or players that are equally interested, but they too have their own problems, don't they? America is overly occupied by what's happening in Gaza, and Europe is under greater strain because of its own security, given America's statements on NATO, on WSUs. Then how is this going to happen? And at what point do you think time will be enough, resources will be enough, and commitment will be enough to forestall the catastrophe in Sudan?
Well, I think we're going through a transitional period. And you see, if you look at the history of the world, the dialectics of global politics and geopolitics is that in every period in history, there is the rise, the decline, the decay, and the final collapse of great powers. And for example, at one time there was a great empire known as the Roman Empire. There was the other powers such as the Chinese, the Persians, the Arabs, the Ottomans, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, the Great Soviet Union, and all of those at one point went through a crisis and declined, and some of them collapsed and disappeared. So we have been in a period of the international liberal order that has existed since the Second World War, which has been dominated by the United States. And to a certain extent, what we are seeing today in the world is a crisis within this dominant power, which has overstretched itself through conflicts, through economic crisis and so on, and is not able to grow to maintain its dominant position. And it's now been challenged. And this overstretch now is reflected in the Middle East. The fact that the United States is just one player that's not able to make any difference because there are other powers. And it reminds me of the famous saying of the Italian philosopher and political thinker Antonio Gramsci, that we are witnessing the old is dying and the new cannot be born, which reflects the twilight period that we're living in, a period of great political, economic, and social upheaval, which is reflected in what's happening in the Middle East, what is happening in Ukraine and Russia's conflict, and other parts of the world. So I think, to a certain extent, America is withdrawing or shrinking from its international responsibilities when it comes to the institutions that were created during the Second World War to deal with this new world order, the United Nations, the multilateral agencies. The United Nations is not able to bring about a ceasefire. The United Nations is not able to support and protect the civilians in the conflicts like the Palestinians. And these institutions have been weakened so much that America is unilaterally intervening in many conflicts and making a lot of decisions that it is not capable of controlling, because it is not the only power. It's no longer a unipolar or the single power as we've had from the experts in international relation, that it's a multipolar, maybe even multiplex environment. And it is very difficult to see how this current crisis in the global, in the geopolitics of the world is going to end because of this fragmentation. And of course, we are seeing the rise of a new power like China, which is rapidly developing technologically. And you see, power is usually either military or technology. And China's rapid rise is creating another kind of conflict point in global politics. Russia has emerged from the decline and the collapse of the Soviet Union and is asserting itself. And so I'm not seeing any quick solution to the to the Middle East crisis, and particularly the issue of the Palestinians, as long as America supports the unilateral, aggressive and illegal actions of Israel against the Palestinian people.
And Dr. Kanenje, that opens up the highlight of what yesterday happened at 10 Downing Street in London, where Sir Keir Starmer, just less than 10 days after the French President Emmanuel Macron also said in September at the UN General Assembly they will recognize Palestine as an independent state. And yesterday the liner there by the UK Prime Minister was then until the Israelis will come up with a substantive solution on the table to forestall what he said were shocking images and what's happening before our own eyes. How is this then also informing how the world is getting into a fluid world order, as pointed out by Hassan?
I'll go back to the words of Gramsci that Mheshimiwa just used, the old are dying and the new are not being born. I'll probably add the new are not being born fast enough to replace the old, and in terms of the world order. Now, Starmer is a centrist. He's not exactly responding to a conviction that actually that needs to be done, but I think it has to do with domestic politics in the fact that Corbyn and Sultana are forming a new party, and by yesterday there were close to 500,000 people who had registered, which is going to threaten actually the power of his own party going forward. And so this is a resurgence or revolution coming from within. And so what we see is around politicians around the world are actually being pushed by their own populations. One, Benjamin Netanyahu, he has been very consistent since his 20s, and anyone in history or historian can actually check in saying there will never be a Palestinian state. So you're not going to expect Benjamin Netanyahu to actually make that happen. I'm just going to give an example to the audience, for people to understand what is happening. Gaza is about half the size of Nairobi. In the first 3 months of the conflict alone, there were more bombs dropped on Gaza than the total number of bombs dropped on London, Hamburg and Dresden, some of the most bombed places in the Second World War, in the 6 years of the Second World War. Today, easily, you could have more bombs dropped on Gaza than any time in recorded history. Literally, the entire infrastructure has been wiped out. What is happening is not just an illegal thing. It's genocide, actually, in Gaza. Something being expressed, not just by observers, people outside, but lots of Jewish scholars, Jewish people, Jewish activists and politicians all across the world. Former Prime Minister, of Israel, was condemning Netanyahu for the kind of crimes against humanity that he's committing. Now, I think what is astounding is, and for those of us in the global south, and this is kind of a message to the collective west, there has been a stain that has been made on the global west, and that is going to be permanent for many, many years to come. Because how can we condemn actions in Ukraine that are nothing like what is actually happening in Gaza? People who are literally defenseless. When you have an apartheid system that is hell-bent on ethnic cleansing, this is not an opinion, these are facts, Now, how does this speak to our new world? One, for those of us who are democratic nicks, who believe in human rights and democracy, this challenges the faith in democracy, because much of our history in the better part of the post-World War II, we've come to believe especially that democracies cannot stand for certain things. And to the extent that democracies have been deaf and blind to what is happening, it actually challenges the notions that democracy, for instance, can deliver for people, but also that democracies cannot stand for the kind of human rights violations we see, that never again after the Holocaust meant something. Apparently, it only means something perhaps when you belong to a certain race. And so this is changing the way the global south is reorganizing itself. It's also providing a room for what I call the rise of the rest to write a new narrative. The challenge is we don't have a new world order, Ayub. We have a new world disorder right now. That is why nothing is working the way everyone should is expecting to work. You know, at the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history. History hadn't even started yet. I think Fukuyama was high on some Kool-Aid, and he should go back and write that book.
Yeah, okay. and Dr. Winnie, is that disorder informed by the underfunding of critical UN agencies that we had seen, which Washington says does not align with its America First policies? And how consequential will this be, given that questions also are bound over then who fills up that vacuum?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just, back to the story on Gaza, as I was listening to our two panelists here, the first thing that came to my mind is this is also a reflection of the global international institutions like the United Nations. And as we are talking about the shifting global realities of our time, we are seeing the more evidence of the weakness of these global international institutions like the United Nations not to be able to respond to these situations as we would like. Because, young people asking, so why is the United Nations not intervening in Gaza? And this calls more reason why there needs to be a reforms of these institutions. And we see even a greater a rise of other institutions speaking more clearly on the matter, like regional institutions, like the Arab League. And so as we are seeing the shift in global geopolitics, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, the inability to silence the guns in Sudan, the inability to silence the gun in the DRC Congo, that is a reflection of a need to reform the global institutions that we have today. And the second thing that came to my mind is, as we watch our television every day, every morning, in the morning before I go to work, I look at how many people are starving. I just think about what does this mean for the fight against terror? Because this is leading a new race of citizens who will be very angry at various countries who they feel are responsible for this war. And for Kenya, I think of Kenya as a country that has been not really picking on sides, whether leaning east or west, but just the fact that we are allied to certain Western powers means that we are also at risk for our national security. So this is a concern not just within the Middle East. It looks far away, but very soon it will be coming back home when we see rise of terror cells that have been silent for a while, and they get really agitated and angry by what we see in the global media every morning. Yeah.
Which then brings us to the question of the underfunding of critical UN agencies. Who will step forward, given what Honorable Yusuf also pointed out, the emergence of powers, including China, who have challenged America's cultural and economic and military hegemon, as a military hegemon. And do you think that they can step up and fill that vacuum?
Do I respond?
Yes,
yeah. I think right now the global power like the United States seems to be looking inward. They seem to want to put their house together, And you can just take the cue from the response from Donald Trump regarding NATO and the fact that Europe needs to take up a little bit more of its burden. And I see European countries have committed to put together 5% of their GDP, which is a lot of money, to support their military. So in the same way, countries need to go back, different countries around the world, not just the global hegemons, but Kenya and all other countries within the United Nations need to rethink the financing of the institution. Another very interesting, I think, activity we are seeing is also rethinking how much they spend on different activities. And we see some agencies moving from New York, United Nations agencies are moving from New York to here, Kenya, which is a very good sign to show that there's discussion on how to restructure your money and how you're spending it in the global systems. How can we make the United Nations more efficient? And how can we give more power to other countries? I know this is a contentious issue. The issue of getting veto power for some of these countries around the world that are not necessarily the top 5 veto countries, such as the United States, China, Great Britain. So there's need for more power for other countries so that the decisions move beyond global rivalries and competition and look inward. So the solutions are not coming from external actors. It's the same member countries that need to commit a little bit more and also commit to pushing for reforms that will lead to power being redistributed within the United Nations.
And Honorable Yusuf, you worked at the UN before. is it fit for purpose, or just holding up under enormous pressure, especially from the big funders who contribute to that, to its kitty like America?
Well, I think the United Nations is a fundamental institution in global affairs. And if it didn't exist, it will be created in order to address issues that nations on their own cannot address. And you have focused only on the financing. The financing is only one aspect of it. The United Nations is the custodian of international law, the international legal system, which the world order is based on. And without the United Nations, there is going to be anarchy and chaos in the world, and nations would have to fend for themselves, particularly nations that are not part of that great power or regional power configuration, economic powers. And I think that is what people are not looking at. These institutions were created after the disaster of the tragedy of the Second World War, in which millions and millions of people died, in which there was a massive destruction unseen in the world before then. And what we are now seeing is a reversal of all those gains. One country in the last 24 months has violated every aspect of international law. The laws of war, the laws, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and is ethnic cleansing and wiping up a whole nation, the Palestinian nation. And the Western countries that were the leaders of this particular movement of the liberal international order are looking the other way, which has exposed the Western hypocrisy and double standards, and have raised doubts about the viability of the liberal system. And I can see that there are other new forces coming into place. For example, there is the BRICS, which is now one of the fastest growing international alliance in the world, which brings large number of countries in the global south. If you remember, when the United Nations was created, not many of these countries in the global south were members. Most of African countries were under colonial rule. And therefore, we didn't have much of a say in the creation and how the international system was working. And Africa and the global south have been campaigning for all these years now for a change, for a reform in the international order, so that we have global governing systems that are representative, that are equitable, that are fairer, and represent the face of the world. Africa is not there, Asia is not there, Latin America is not there. So to a certain extent, the current crisis provides an opportunity for the world, not only to strengthen the UN system, which is absolutely necessary. Whether you reform it or whether you change it is an administrative matter. But the fact is that without the United Nations, the world would not function as it is functioning now. Everybody would be fighting, every nation would be fighting for itself, and there would be wars and crises everywhere. International cooperation is not going to work. International law would be put into the dustbin of history, and that's not where the world needs to go. The world needs to be to work together through cooperation, through friendship, and there has to be some legislation or some way of working together, and the United Nations provides the foundation for that. You don't destroy an institution that can do all of that outside the nation-state system that we know of. So I think there's very important role here. Even if at the humanitarian level, if you look, the people of Gaza are starving. What agency can mount an intervention at the level to save the people of Gaza from starvation and from death? The United Nations is the only institution that is capable of doing that. But Israel and its allies in the West are doing everything to undermine that, and to undermine what works for the rest of the world. And I think they need to pull back. I'm glad that, in fact, some of the Western countries have started criticizing the ethnic cleansing and the genocide that is going on in Israel, in Palestine. And Britain's position of recognizing the state of Palestine is historic, given the fact that it is Britain that planted the current problem in the Middle East by creating a state within the state and the nation of Palestine, planting a new population, a new country in the middle of a community, an indigenous community that has existed. That the source, the main cause of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict started from the Balfour Declarations. So the fact that Britain, the former British empire that created this problem, is taking a stand today is very significant, and I think would start a process in which more countries would come out to recognize the state of Palestine and to accept the existence of the Palestinian people as an independent and sovereign state.
Yeah. Dr. Kanenje, Honorable Yusuf points out the critical preservation of the rule of law and the safeguarding of the institutions of the United Nations. However, how can that happen when there is a rise in nationalism in Europe, as you had seen, which borders on hate, racism, and Islamophobia that we had seen? You have seen in America the fascism which is on the rise. Donald Trump is back at the White House. And ideally then, you have also seen the anathema towards the ICC when it indicted the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which was never a similar call when African heads of state were tried before the court for crimes against humanity. How then can this be done? And you had seen also the barrage of attacks against Agnes Callamard, who had documented right abuses, the special rapporteur on human rights abuses of the United Nations. In this context then, how can this happen when there is an open bias for one country, for example, yet there are rules and order that must be preserved for the world to be in harmony?
As Mheshimiwa said, when the United Nations was being founded, most countries in Africa as well as the Global South were not even independent yet. I think there were slightly more than 50, countries. And so one thing that has been lacking is the agency of much actually of the world. I've always challenged some of my friends, especially because, in the Western world, when we discuss about international community, because most of the time international community, rarely does it actually refer to the entire world. A lot of times, if there are complaints about the international community, it's about the collective West, which comprise about only 12% of the world population. 88% of the world population is outside that. And so 88% of the world population is actually outside the critical decision-making, organs of the international system. Now, that is not sustainable. Now, you raise an issue about open bias, Yes, that's all the more reason why we need to reform the international system, to be able to build more agency and for countries to have more say. Why would you have the same countries in the P5 since 1945 when both the world economy, geopolitics, as well as populations have changed? The world is not the same. Number two, I think as Yusuf said, there is a change, there is a shift that is taking place. And so it's a period of relative chaos, so to speak.
Yeah.
But then there is urgency to recognize that unless we actually start going back to the rules-based international system, it cannot be sustainable. Part of the actions, unilateral actions being taken by countries is in response to what is perceived progressively, or what has evolved as a trend of unilateralism in the better part of the last 30 years. Immediately following the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine, Ambassador Kimani gave an extremely eloquent speech at the United Nations, which was lauded by a lot of people around the world, especially our friends in the West. And one thing I've been very keen in talking about that speech is we focused a lot more on the two-thirds of the speech. The last part of the speech of Kimani, he spoke about the trend of unilateralism being practiced by members, including members of the Security Council. And that is what has sent a wrong message that both big as well as emerging powers, they are intervening in countries unilaterally with impunity, you see, to the extent where you do not know what happens next. We don't know where the war is going to start next. The other day, even the framing of it. Israel launched what they called a preemptive attack. There is nothing like that in international law against Iran, assassinating its leaders, you know. But what do you hear? They're talking about a war. No, that was actually a country attacking another against the United Nations. But they can do that. You know why? Because they can. Why? Because other countries are actually doing the same thing. And unless we actually go back, we'll not be able to address whether the conflict in the Middle East or in Europe, or even the conflict is going on in Africa. So I think it's important, especially as there is a relative decline of Western agency in controlling international affairs, there is a responsibility to those who are emerging to start putting their heads together and say, how can we be able to shape the agenda? And we have seen an effort being done on Gaza right now, not starting in the traditional capitals, but elsewhere. There should also be efforts in other theaters to start defining the message, setting an agenda, and shaping the discourse, because that is the only way, going back to the rules-based international system, that we can actually truly going to secure and save the world.
Yeah. Is that why, Dr. Winnie, we are seeing less attention on, for example, the crisis in Sudan, the long-time instability status in Somalia, the DRC that we had seen? It took the Qatari government's effort to bring Paul Kagame and Felix Tshisekedi together through the Emir of Qatar, Al Thani. How is this then messaging the commitment by the West, as it had always projected itself of advancing good values, democracy and human rights?
Yeah, and I think then the next point I was going to talk about is values, value system. Yeah, and the value system, the rule-based order is based on a value system of respect for human rights, intervening in periods of human rights catastrophes and where you have human rights violations. And we are clearly seeing from the last two speakers, there's a question about the rule-based order as it is right now. But what I'm really finding interesting inspiration from is looking at how the European Union is restructuring itself. The need to hold back to those values and cling to them in this time where many, can we say, countries like the United States, we're used to them intervening in this crisis or calling for a cessation of hostilities. We are seeing less of that intervention. And so looking at how the European Union is sticking to their value system. Again, back to the Finland president, I really listened to him because he was saying something very interesting about how other countries are restructuring in this very flux geopolitical order. And one of the things he talked about when it comes to the Finnish foreign policy is the interest in value-based foreign policy system. So based on that question of value, I think even the African Union countries can go back to our own value system. We value democracy, not only democracy, but human rights and respect for the rights of people. And when we see different regions coming together and speaking more loudly about this need to strengthen the rule-based order, it gives me hope. And so I think I'll just comment on that European perspective.
Yeah. And Honorable Yusuf, then, if we are to move this conversation forward, ideally you have talked about the emergence of America from World War II as the sole superpower, but of course the changes over time have also been informed by global dynamics, including a continental Europe that is aging, an America that is finding its place as the sole superpower challenged. But is it worrying also when the holder of the office in Washington praises autocrats and causes up to dictators?
But you know, in terms of foreign policy, there isn't democracy is not reflected. Yeah. The United States has supported many autocratic regimes. It's been involved in undermining and the removal of democratic states that have opposed America's policy, for example, in Latin America and many parts of the world. It has intervened on many issues to protect its self-interest, regardless of its democratic credentials. So I think the United States has to maintain relationship. Autocracy, dictatorship is something that is subjective. When you describe, in fact, a country like China or as a dictatorship, it is a subjective response, which is mostly a negative perception of an opponent of China. But China would claim, would say that it's more democratic, perhaps, than some of the liberal democracies in the world. So I would say that in terms of foreign policy, every country has relationship with all the countries of the world. For example, we have embassies in countries that never hold elections, but because of our own economic and political interests, we maintain those relationships, and America is not an exception. What is an exception is when you undermine the rule of law, when you undermine the rules-based system, and you stop the United Nations from fulfilling its main mandate of sustaining and maintaining peace and security in the world. You create an insecure and unstable global system, and that's what is worrying in the approach of the American president, in the sense that he is not interested in maintaining peace and security around the world. He's only interested in what is good for America as a country, unilaterally. And I think if you look at Europe, Europe could have played a major role in global affairs. The European Union is a big force economically, but it is subservient to American interests, global interests. It is an appendix of the United States when it comes to global foreign policy. It has not been able to stand on its own, although now, because of the fear that perhaps the United States may not stand with Europe in case of war, they are beginning to fall back to creating, to investing in military hardware, military equipment, which may not necessarily be the best thing for the world. The world does not need more armament. The world doesn't need more wars. The world needs peace and security, equity, and social justice, so that we reduce and deal with the underlying problems of insecurity in the world, because poverty, underdevelopment, and so on. But the answer is not entirely military might and military power. For example, one of the great things about China is the fact China's economic rise and dominance is entirely peaceful. It is not based on military dominance, in the conquering of territory, in expansionism, in fueling wars in other parts of the world. And this is a remarkable example that perhaps the world could see as an example. We can all rise as nations of the world, as the people of the world, without spending a lot of our effort and energy on wars of destruction, because that is a lose-lose situation. What we need is a global system that is based on a win-win situation. And that's why we must reject the rule of the jungle, unilateralism, impunity of the powerful states, and go back to the basics. And to a certain extent, the United Nations may not be the perfect institution as people might expect from it, but it forms the basis of building that new, more equitable world order that we're looking for.
And Dr. Kanenje, then, having talked about that, and of course we will proceed with it, how does Africa then position itself in this whole debate, given that you talked about pre-colonial times when the United Nations was conceived after World War II, and now with a population that is young, a market that is ripe, climate that is conducive both for investments and life, how can Africa then position itself in light of what we have talked about and the changes that are happening?
The African Union has been, I think, very vocal with regard to wanting to be represented at, especially at the table within the United Nations. For instance, to have a permanent seat there. But I think it's important to remember that you don't get respected when you don't respect yourself. This begging bowl kind of attitude that we've had, I think, needs to stop. Now, it was good that some of the Pan-Africanist leaders came up with African solutions to African problems. But what I've always added is what is more important than African solutions to African problems is do it with African money. Today, as we speak, regionally, IGAD has a budget of about 200 million, the AU about 600 million or so. Most of it is actually funded by foreigners. Do you really want to tell me, as a country, we cannot raise $600 million? Is money that is stolen in one of the projects in African countries? Any? You understand? Like in 1 week. Because if we move in that direction, not only are we going to build agency, we're actually going to start solving some of our problems. You see, we have no control over what happens outside there, but at least we have a say. Now, even within the region, for instance, how can we be able to have a vehicle that has to be fueled by somebody else and then expect we're going to determine where that vehicle is going to go? Some of the regional problems we have, we can actually be able to establish a kitty and mechanisms to start funding it. And so one of the things that has also been deviled us as a continent is we've not built our own agency in a way that we build a degree of independence that can allow even others to listen to us. Number two, for us to be listened to, we have to organize ourselves to enhance and build a stronger agency for that. But when we are disparate and divided, and we don't really seem to be having an agenda, or we are waiting for solutions from outside, when it comes to some small problems or some interstate, sometimes with interstate conflicts, we cannot be able to do that. It's actually going to become crucially difficult. Africa is going to be 2.5 billion people in the next 25 years. Is going to contribute the largest percentage of population that are young and who, in terms of workforce. It's also going to remain one of the fastest growing regions in the world outside the Asia Pacific region. Yeah. Do we have these metrics and how do we make use of them? Because the future actually is here. But I think what has been lacking is organization. And as they say, if you're not organized, you're going to remain agonizing.